Hi, so I've had a question today about braking. This is really for learner riders and for people who are just starting off learning to ride and going on the road for maybe the first time, and also using this through their training when getting ready for their Module 1 and Module 2 test. And it's about braking. So how do we brake? Well, there's a couple of things to remember when you're braking. Always apply the brakes gently to start with to get the brakes binding, and then apply a little bit more pressure to the brakes to allow the brake pads to go against the disc gently so that it doesn't go sharply against the disc and cause problems. A lot of the bikes these days have got ABS, but don't just rely on that. Get used to braking properly. So the way that I would remind people to use their brakes is when the bike's in an upright position and travelling in a straight line, turn the power off, use the front brake and the rear brake to slow the speed of the bike down. And that way the bike slows down nice and gently. Again, very gentle application of the brakes. If the bike's in a corner or banking over, then leave the front brake alone. And what you can do is just turn the power off and just use a little tiny bit of rear brake. And what that will do is just slow the bike down so that if the lean angle isn't quite right, then it will tip the bike a little bit more into the corner. But what you want to do when you've got some steering input into the handlebars, you just leave the front brake alone, and certainly you don't want to be snatching on that front brake. The other thing to bear in mind is if you've got any steering input into the bars or you're riding slowly, then just use a rear brake only. And the reason we do that is if you imagine the bike's like this and we jab the front brake on, we're going to load the front end and put all the weight down through the forks into the front wheel. And what will happen, the suspension will spring back in like a catapult effect. And if you are steering the bike when you're coming into a junction or roundabout, or even if you're coming into a stop and you've got some steering input into the bars, what will happen is the bike will dip and then it will catapult back a little bit. And if you're not ready for that, then you could topple over when you're at the junction. And we see this quite a lot when people come into junctions and they're stopping. Instead of following the curb round to the left and they're looking to the right and they jab that front brake on while they're looking to the right, then they can't control that catapult effect of the bike, and it doesn't sometimes move over a little bit too far, causing them to over topple, and then they just fall off at a stationary speed where at the junction. So my advice is when the bike's in an upright position, travelling in a straight line, use both brakes. If the bike's banked over or leaning over, or you've got input on the steering, then turn the power off and just gently use the rear brake. If the bike is travelling at slow speed and that's under, say, 10 miles an hour, second gear or first gear at that kind of speed, then just use a rear brake only, especially if you're near the junction or a stopping position and you've got some input into the steering. So I hope that helps, and that's just a little bit of information about using the brakes when you're a learner and just starting out, so that you don't get yourself into trouble by over braking or panic braking and grabbing big handfuls on the front brake. So I hope that's answered the question for the person who's asked. If you got any questions, any problems with that, just give me a shout. More than happy to give you a little bit of guidance and a little bit more information on how to use the brakes.